almost all home routers is pretty basic and doesn't support serious security configuration. This is simply because routers are mass market devices and the manufacturers don't want ordinary users complaining that the router isn't working after they played around with it too much or because it's just too complex for the users. But obviously you are not an ordinary user and you need more power and options for security. And to get more power, we can install on the router free open source custom firmware. This will speed up the router, provide many more security features like VPNs, VLANs, isolated Wi-Fi, authentication servers, IP tables, live traffic monitoring, logging, and so on. The standard firmware that comes with the home routers that you buy, you should be worried about backdoors, as there has been many documented cases and security bugs. Custom firmware helps to mitigate these issues. A number of custom firmware options for routers exist, and you can see a list of the common ones here. To install custom firmware, generally what you do is you go to the site of the open source router firmware that you've decided that you want to install. You download the new firmware, which will be some sort of file, some sort of binary. Then, as shown in this diagram for a Netgear, using the admin console, you perform a router upgrade by uploading the custom firmware file to the router. And this is referred to as flashing the router. And if we look down here, you can see the router's going through its update process here. And then finally you get the new firmware. In this case, this is Ddwrt. You do have to be very careful though and make sure you have the right firmware for your router, otherwise you can brick your router. And then you're going to really struggle to get it working again. So please be careful. Your manufacturer won't help you if you've tried to install custom firmware, or at least they're very unlikely to help you. I cannot help you if you brick your router. I can't help myself if I brick my own router. But it should all go fine if you match the router with the correct custom firmware. And depending on the custom firmware that you pick, there'll be documentation and there'll be website information that matches that custom firmware with your router, if indeed there is custom firmware that is available for your router. The first option you have for custom firmware for your router is Ddwrt, which is an embedded operating system based on the Linux kernel, primarily used on embedded devices to route network traffic. It is the firmware from which many other of the custom firmwares were actually born. It's used in printers, webcams, in all sorts of Internet of Things devices and routers as well. The main components are the Linux kernel. It's got util Linux, it's got uclibc, and it's also got BusyBox. If you're not familiar with BusyBox, you will see this on a number of routers. BusyBox, as it describes itself, is a multi-core binary that combines many common Unix utilities into a single executable. And you can see here a list of all the executables that it includes in there: grep, httpd, sed, sendmail, etc. With Ddwrt, all components have been optimized for size to be small enough for fitting into the limited storage and memory available in home routers and other Internet of Things devices. It is configurable using the command line interface, which looks like this, which is the same as many other command line interfaces, or via this web interface, but it's not the easiest to use and install compared to the other custom firmwares that I'm going to go through. It does, however, support the broadest range of hardware: travel routers, home routers, enterprise routers. Plus there are about 3,500 odd optional software packages available for install via the OPKG package management system, which is a really good feature. It supports real-time network monitoring, VLANs, network isolation, VPN client, VPN server, and the 3,500 other optional packages that I just mentioned. It offers the most flexibility among the firmware options. And if you want an easier interface for it, you could try Gargoyle, which some people find easier to use, which you can get from here. Next is Ddwrt, now renamed to LibreCMC. It's based on the OpenWRT, which I've just shown you, but it supports only a handful of devices. You could build it yourself, although it's not a project for beginners. This is the list of supported hardware, and a list of tested hardware is here. Its benefit is that it adheres to the Free Software Foundation's free system distribution guidelines, which is why you might want to go for it. But it's not easy to use and install, so like I said, it's not a project for beginners. And finally on my recommended list is Ddwrt. This is also based on OpenWRT, so it's another Linux-based firmware which supports many of the same features of OpenWRT, like real-time network monitoring, VLANs, network isolation, OpenVPN client, OpenVPN server, etc. It is easier to install and use than OpenWRT, but it doesn't support as many routers. But it does support most of the common home routers. You can have a look here to see if your router is supported, and you just type it in and see whether or not it's supported and under what revision. The user interface looks like this, as you've seen already with my demonstrations. And of course you can access it via the command line by SSH, which again I've already demonstrated. And you can see here is support for BusyBox. I personally use Ddwrt for my router and also have a separate hardware firewall running something called pfSense we will discuss shortly, but that is another firmware, but it's more dedicated towards the firewall side of things as opposed to the router side of things. Note, your existing router may or may not be able to upgrade to a custom firmware. If you can't find an open firmware that supports your router, or the one you want doesn't work with the router you have, you do have the option to buy a router specifically for the firmware you want to run, obviously. I recommend this router if you're looking for something pretty high-end. This is a Netgear R7000 AC 1900. It isn't cheap. In pounds, it's £129, which translates probably to around $170 US dollars. But obviously you don't need to go to this expense, especially if you've already got a compatible router. It's just if you're looking for something high-end, this is a good choice. If you have a look at this website, this is a very good website for checking out router performance. They do independent evaluations, and you can actually see the one I've just recommended is here at the top in terms of throughput, which is not surprising because you are paying for it. But check this website out. And as an example, you get the firmware from here for that particular router and for Ddwrt. But you'll be able to find the location of the firmware on the links that I've given you for the particular firmware. For whatever firmware you go for, make sure you check out their router compatibility list to make sure that the router you get, if you're buying one specifically to get custom firmware, make sure first that it is compatible. And actually you can see here at the top the D7000, which I've just shown you. If flashing your router seems a little scary or you want to save time, you can get ready-made flash routers with these custom firmwares. And here is one such place where you can get it, flash routers. I do not recommend this site. I'm only aware of it. I've not used their services. I neither know whether they are good or bad. So as you can see here, you can just select the brand of what you want. So say a Netgear. Choose a firmware, we'll go with Ddwrt. We'll choose the AC 1900, which I showed you. And there you are. But as you can see, it's a little bit pricier than if you were to buy it with the standard firmware on it. But there you are, that is an option. With a custom router, you really do have more power. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. So here you can see you can run Tor on your router and Torify all devices traffic or some devices traffic. So that could be a useful feature for you. More on that in its own section, in the section on Tor. Another example of what you can do with custom firmware, you can set up a VPN client on the router. You can configure it, for example, to route all traffic of your devices or traffic for a specific device based on certain conditions. So, for example, if you want your mobile phone to go over the VPN, then you can send that over the VPN, or if you want your work laptop to go over the VPN, you can set it up to do that. More on VPNs and setting that up in its own section. Another common custom firmware that you will see a lot is Tomato, but I don't recommend this. Although it is easier to use and install than most of the other firmware, it's not really been well maintained and updated in a long time. It is also possible to use pfSense as a router firewall, which we will discuss in the section on network firewalls.
Okay, so that's the end of our video, no? Sige. Dayon, mo-stop ko sa sharing ha. Okay. So, ang ato ani is sa inyohang activity, akong gi-check o ya, ang uban is sa inyong gistorya is wala man mo'y mga kanang PC or laptop, ang uban nagamit ra mag cellphone. So nangita kog paagi in order that naagid the activity for this week, no? So ani na lang, another is kung mo gamit sad ta ang inyong signal din ha, pertisang hinaya, no? So usually ang ato ang gibuhat katong sa video is mo gamit gid tag internet adto kung mag-scan ta sa ato ang router. Okay. So ang inyong activity for today is ang first, ang duha ani is a question, no? Kay para lang jud kung akong i-check o sa inyong knowledge, na? So ang isa, 3 questions naman ni siya. So ang isa is you have to perform, okay? So mo perform mo sa katubitang quick-wise trick using canary. So mao to inyong i-perform. Then duha inyong i-perform. Ang first is the Word document. Then, ang the second is the email ad. Okay. So, while nag-perform mo, you have to get video of yourself in performing the activity. So, not only on yourself, but you have to include the screen of the devices na inyong gigamit. Then, after that, you have to attach the file. Ha? So, ang katong inyong video nga file, inyong i-attach sa ato ang link nga akong ihatag ninyo. So, if nag-video mo adto, ang inyong video is only the screen without yourself, then mag-usab jud mo video. Kay katong uban, nag-send na ko, akong gitanaw, screen raman ang gihatag. So, naagyod siya nga you are performing yun, no? Nga kamo gyud nag-perform. Okay. So, mauna. Ako ang ikuan nga. Ang uban, nag-practice, nag-video dayon, then gisend nako. So, ang akong gingon is, mag-practice mo. Ang wala pa ka-practice, then mag-practice. Kay, I will give you an activity, but okay ra, ma'am. Sige, why problema? Copy, ma'am. Sige. Kanang ang kuan man good is, mag-router, wala man kayo, no? Gawas og si Jaya magpataod og internet cafe kay nawagtang si Jaya. Ana di ay. Kay adto mo sa ilahang Jaya magpundo. No? Kisa may magpataod nga nag-internet coffee. Oh, pwede ta. Nya. Sa namin nanawag na ko. Bahala na siya nanawag. Ay, di na ako tubagon. Okay, so. Di na tubagon ang nanawag. So far, nagklase pa ko dire. Ani, kanang, unsay nga na, nawagtang ko da. So, ang activity is, akong ihatag ninyo, no? So, muhatag ko the activity, unsay nga na. After na sa quiz, nato karon